My first piece of costume jewelry was basically in coup de coeur in the Marché aux Puces in Paris with my girlfriend. We were like 13 years old. And I saw these pair of Chanel earrings, and I said, you know, I couldn't afford it, and she couldn't afford it. So we said, if we put our money together, we can maybe buy it, and then we'll share it. So that's the beginning of the collection.
If I weren't a jewelry designer, oh, I'd be a tree. No, I don't know. There wasn't any question. When I was a kid, I embarrassed my poor dad. I'm the fourth of 6 kids in from a little tiny town in Nebraska, and I just embarrassed my poor dad so often. At 10 years old, I was knocking on old ladies' doors saying, "Do you have any old jewelry I can take apart?"
My relationship with costume jewelry started like most little girls, playing with their mom's jewelry, playing dress up, but then it progressed to actually buying vintage pieces in the 70s and the 80s. I used to go to yard sales and estate sales, and anytime anybody was selling jewelry, I was the first one there. I used to go with a gang of people, and we'd go, our Saturday mornings were yard sale mornings. The guys would go looking for tools and machinery, and I'd go right to the jewelry.
It was my grandmother. It was definitely my grandmother. And again, I also grew up in an era when you could see old movies on TV every day, and there was no Turner Classic, but there was a thing called the $1 Million Movie, and I remember sneaking, I wasn't supposed to stay up that late, but where I would sneak up and watch that. And you know, I would see these 30s movies with people, they were drinking and they were smoking and they had all this fabulous jewelry, and it all looked so sophisticated and urbane and chic, and it seemed like this world that I wanted to live in that world.
Hollywood has always played a huge role in setting the trends for all kinds of jewelry, but they use costume jewelry mostly, and you know, we all want to feel like the movie stars a little bit, so people would buy jewelry to be a little bit closer to their dreams, to the women that inspired them.
For many, many centuries, the people who made fashion made fine. If you were working in costume, you were also working in fine. The techniques were exactly the same. The same setters, the same metals in many cases, silver was used in both. And the craftsmanship is superb. So a lot of the 18th and 19th century, what we would call paste or fake jewels, were set beautifully and lasted a lot longer than the diamonds, which were invariably broken apart.
Fine jewelry and costume jewelry over the years have influenced one another in an interesting way. In the 1930s and 40s, women who could not afford fine jewelry would buy jewelry that had what the designers call the look of real. Companies like Trifari, DeRosa, Panino, these are all companies that were in existence in the 30s and the 40s, and they made jewelry that was very, very finely made, and with the same, many of the artisans making the jewelry, as I said, had come here from Europe, and they were trained. Some of them worked for, Boucher worked for Cartier. A lot of them worked for the finest houses, jewelry houses. Van Cleef in Europe came here and used those same kinds of tools and the same kind of concept of stone setting, everything done by hand, models made by hand. Model is something that is done before a piece is cast, if it's a cast piece. And those were, you could hardly tell the difference. A jeweler could with a loupe and see that it wasn't a sapphire, but it was a piece of blue glass.
I will get an idea from a Harry Winston necklace, and then I'll usually make it bigger because I can. I think that actually sometimes people who design real diamond jewelry are inspired by costume jewelry. I think it works both ways because you can take risks in costume jewelry that you can't take with real jewelry. And if I can, contradict myself, real jewelers take risks sometimes too. Because of my knowledge of this subject, I know that jewelers in the past have made up extraordinary pieces of jewelry that no one would buy because they were just too expensive or they were a little bit nutty. Then they take all the stones out, they melt down the metal, and they start over. So I think it works both ways.
So I think the telling moment for when costume jewelry became acceptable both in fashion and in society was when Mademoiselle Chanel started wearing simulated pearls and jewelry made out of gilt metal, probably bronze, and mixing it in with her fine jewelry. And all of a sudden, because she so much was in the forefront of women's comfortable fashions and women's French fashions, that everyone around the world started to say, I can wear these cheap little pearls and throw them in with some of my diamonds and look how fabulous I look. And that was the beginning, I think, when it was totally acceptable.
Miriam Haskell started by Miriam Haskell in 1926, and she moved to New York from Indiana as a young woman ready to take on the world. And she is really considered one of the first to do costume jewelry in America that was supposed to look like fashion and costume and express a woman's individuality rather than look of real. One of the most important elements, of course, of Miriam Haskell is that it's all handmade in New York and made in the USA, and it's handmade the way it's always been, and it's always been produced in New York. And so New York is a big part of the heritage and was a big part of Miriam's inspiration as well, and it continues to be, I think, one of the most significant elements of the brand.
People have gone to war over pieces of jewelry. And that's what I find fascinating, is there's a lot of lore, there's a lot of symbolism. You know, people actually believed at one time that if you wore amethysts, you could drink as much wine as you wanted and you wouldn't get drunk. I don't know how long it took them to figure out that this didn't really work, but that's what they believed, that if you wore a ruby, you know, into battle on the battlefield, it would make you brave, you know, all of these things. And there's still is a symbolism to jewelry up until Victorian times where it was a message.
You have to have affection for what you have on and think about it. I mean, I want people to see that these pieces, I mean, Barbara is very outrageous because she cares mostly about not so much about the value of the jewelry. She cares about the design, and she cares about how it's evolving, and you know, and that's courageous.
It's never been who is the designer, what it cost. It's always been, it spoke to me. It was I just would see it and I said, this I have to have. I didn't know the design, I didn't know the year, I'm completely dispersed in that sense. I'm not an historical, it was nothing historical, the collection. It was really the coup de coeur. And it was the fantasy. My collection is very Baroque. It's who I am. It's very over the top. It's based on fantasy. I never collected the teeny little thing. It was always the fabulous.
In fine jewelry, the intrinsic value is laid out very clearly. We were the first tax collectors. We were not very well liked jewelers. So in the Appraisal Society, the trouble with an appraisal of a fashion or a fine jewelry, of costume jewelry, is based upon the fact that who made it, where was it made, how was it made, and what materials were used, not in so much as the intrinsic value, but how it played a part in society. If you notice, most of the costume jewelry in auction catalogs are pictured on the individuals wearing them, or the gowns that are with it. Even insofar as the recent one of Liz Taylor, a lot of her pieces were not fine, they were fashion, but yet they were pictured with items that she wore. That will increase the value about tenfold. If it's a $400 piece, it was worn by Liz Taylor, it's on an outfit that's discernible and of a period, $4,000.
Would you believe Elizabeth Taylor had a huge collection of costume jewelry? I had the great honor of being hired by Christie's last summer to appraise all of her costume jewelry for the sale they were having. That was amazing. She had a lot of Versace. She had Chanel. But the Chanel was the ladylike Chanel. It wasn't the wild Chanel that we think of that's more contemporary. But she had some fabulous pieces by Signer, by... The most outstanding ones I can remember were the Versace ones. I love those, but I couldn't take them home with me. The most amazing thing is that It can be worn by someone like Elizabeth Taylor, and it can be worn by all the rest of us.
You can do it all and just have a good time with it. Actually, the basic thing in fashion jewelry is to have a wonderful time and to be who you are, to present your personality in front of the world. I mean, it's who I am. If I'm wearing pearls, it's a pearl day. I'm a pearl lady. I mean, I love pearls. I want strass, I put the strass on. It's who you are today. And that's what's important, because you can change. Tomorrow you can be someone else. You can be Gothic if you want.